welcome to the Weekly Whiff podcast, where my good friend Shaun from 28 Post and I will be discussing a myriad of things, namely starting with my tendency and insatiable urge to murder 3 chickens that are currently sitting about 3 feet to my left.
Yeah, they're cool. I can't hear them at all, like, on my end. Like, I heard them a bit before when you mentioned them, but now, like, the underwater ASMR is, like, completely drowning them out. So, at least people only have to worry about the audio quality and not, like, the chicken quality.
Yeah, I mean, I can put the mics up to the chicken if you want some chicken ASMR.
Oh, maybe we could do that later.
Fine. Yeah, no, I got you, man. How's your week? Tell me a story.
How's my week been? I have done almost like nothing noteworthy. I had a few things that I was going to mention, but actually, I know. So between the last 2 episodes, my week's been pretty good because Kaguya Season 3 got announced for like a more official date, so that was pretty good. Yeah, April next year, I think, is what was listed. So it's pretty keen on that. It's getting closer and closer, and I'm very, very keen for Season 3. I imagine if we are still doing the pod at that point, there will likely be a whole Kaguya episode. Because I will have a lot to say about Season 3 when it's like all said and done, whether I hate it or love it.
Because it's always that question, isn't it? It's always a bit of a dice roll when you're adapting like manga arcs into an anime to find out what the right narrative beats, whether it's cohesive or not. Like, yeah.
I have my hopes of it. A1 Pictures, which is the studio doing it, have been doing really good with Kaguya, and in general, they've been doing really good with anime adaptations recently as well. So I have my hopes. I'd be very disappointed if Season 3 ended up being bad.
Yeah. No.
Besides, oh no, you can keep going.
No, I was just saying, I've always been pretty impressed by A1 anime adaptations in terms of the quality of the presentation and of like the cinematography and just the art and everything is always like really on point. I find the voice actors.
Yeah, the voice actors do their best. They're like fucking phenomenal. A1's like a weird one though because sometimes they can be very hit or miss from what I understand. Like they have a lot of good adaptations, but I think a lot of their original works end up being a lot more lackluster, and some of their adaptations can be a bit iffy as well, from what I understand. I haven't looked too much into their performance, but I do think A1 was always kind of like that studio where people were like, oh, they could be really good or they could be really bad, or maybe I'm just pulling shit out of my ass and getting them mixed up with another studio. But I do remember that being a thing. And then when Kage came out, like I think a lot of people were like, holy shit, this is one of their good ones, thank God.
Yeah, absolutely. They didn't just dial this in. That's nice. Yeah.
Yeah. Besides that, I haven't been playing too many noteworthy games, and I talk about games enough in my weekly recap, so I don't want people to think I'm dependent on video games. I haven't been watching much anime either. I've actually been thinking that getting into cosplay a little bit, thanks to a friend I have.
Really?
Yeah. There are a few characters I want to. Sorry, I thought I heard like a door close, but I think it was just a wind, and no one's home right now, so I hope I don't get killed live on the pod. But there's a few characters I've been wanting to cosplay, and I've got a friend who's massively into cosplay right now, and they've been like really encouraging that kind of rabbit hole that I want to dive down. So I've been looking into certain ways to do characters and that, and it's a lot of fun. I always thought cosplay would be fun, but like actually planning out one and trying to do it is really, really fun.
I had like one cosplay idea, which was just the shit ever. But no, two. One I would love to do is this is the sort of semi-serious one. I would love to do like a Harry Dresden cosplay. Like
that's Dresden Files, right? Or something. That's the series you talked about.
Yeah, so just tall guy in a duster with a big like carved stick and a hat. Although he doesn't really have a hat in the actual novels, so maybe I can get away with not doing that. That'd just be really cool to put. He's got like signatures. He's got his rings he wears. It'd be cool. It'd be cool to do that. Carry around a couple of sticks and just pretend that I'm a wizard for a day. That'd be nice. And the other one is I wanted to do the Pride from Dark Souls.
The Prior. What did you say?
The deprived class. So when you just go like nothing but a big wooden club and like a stupid like shield thing made out of planks of wood.
Okay.
The meme-worthy
one. Yep.
Down in the loincloth at anime conventions scare people. Yeah, no, those are my only real 2 ideas that I've ever had. So yeah, what would you want to do?
Right now I'm like planning on doing a character from Gravity Rush, which is a niche as fuck game. So I highly doubt what that game is. It's like real fucking niche.
Existence, but I don't know which character you're talking.
Oh, you know if it's existent? That's surprising to me.
I know
It's like a male character in the game that I like his design a lot. So I'm thinking about doing that. And I always wanted if I was to do cosplay, I always wanted to be a character that was like, or from a game or from a series that meant a lot to me, just as a first time. So yeah,
that'd be really cool, man.
Yeah, no, if I end up doing anything about it, I'll definitely bring it up again or whatever. But it's definitely something I'm looking into right now, and it's a lot of fun. I am very much enjoying like the planning process of it.
I'm gonna post pictures on Twitter on the weekly Whiff.
The weekly Whiff, yeah, Twitter that like hardly ever is active.
I actually need to put up a thing like, oh yeah, by the way, guys, we're up to like 25 episodes now. Yeah.
Yeah, we're in season 2.
We've got to.
Did you cut out or something? I can't hear you right now. Oh.
In the season, we'll have 25 episodes.
All right, you just cut out for a bit there, and I didn't hear any of that, so you might have to repeat yourself.
Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, I think it might have been more internet than like your phone.
It was just my dad just tried to call me live on the pod. How about it?
Nice.
Yeah.
Guest speaker.
Nah, fine. If it's urgent, I'm sure we'll sort something out and be all right.
Hopefully.
All right. Anyway, yeah. So your week cosplay is on the brain.
Basically, yeah. Cosplay's on the rain. Well, that's definitely what I'm calling the fucking title. Not the title, but like just my section of the fucking recording. What about your week, Pete?
Crimson Vow came out for Magic the Gathering, so that is not.
God fucking damn it.
So it's like super hectic vampire wedding style sort of set, which was really cool. So I went to that and did all that sort of stuff, which was really mad. Yeah, dude, aside from that, not a huge amount. Just been sort of hunting around and looking at some stuff. Been getting back into some writing lately, which has been really good. And,
nice.
Nah, aside from that, man, nothing huge, nothing sort of super special.
It's good that you're getting into writing there. This year I've been trying to write once a week, and it's been really fun. Like, just felt like I've been kind of like at least like writing a small bit every week has kind of gotten me back into the groove a little bit.
My goodness, I'm getting another call.
Oh god.
You just tried to call me again, dude. Yeah. No. Okay. I'll tell you what we're gonna do. You're gonna keep the crowd entertained while I call them back real quick.
All right.
But I'm gonna be right back. I just gotta sort this out and make sure no one's died. Give me a
Well, now it is officially my pod then. I am I don't know what I'm going to do in this time, but I guess I will keep talking about how Magic the Gathering sucks and Yu-Gi-Oh is much better. Magic the Gathering doesn't have cool, edgy protagonist hairstyle characters, so obviously Magic is inferior in every way. There are no deity god entities fighting teenage children that I'm aware of. Actually, maybe let's this would be fun. I'm going to search up Magic the Gathering lore right now, and we're going to see how this turns out. Magic the Gathering lore, Magic story. What the fuck is this? Magic the Gathering. What the fuck? There's like a whole. I didn't realize there was a whole website. Is this? Sorry, now I'm actually going down a rabbit hole and I'm confused. Timeline. Maybe there is more. Maybe let's see. What dating systems? The infinite planes of the multiverse do not carry. Oh, dating systems, not fucking. I thought it was like a rom-com or like a dating simulator for a second. I was super confused. I'm such a fucking plebeian idiot. Oh.
Hello, I am back. I'm here. I'm sorry. I don't know what the hell's going on. I'm going to hazard a guess he's going to call me again in a second.
Okay, interesting.
We're ducking in and out. Yeah. Anyway, just as a short point, this is the most scuffed episode ever. Apologize in advance. No, so I was this week was just last couple of weeks, man. I've been listening back to our old pods. I did have a brief poke at a Dance in the Vampire Bund, which is like a really random weird anime from like the 2010, 2012 or something. It's really odd, man. Like it's really, really odd.
I've never heard of it. Dance in the.
It's weird, dude. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. It's very, very freaking strange. Anyway, it's got some weird overtones to it, and I'm not why I'm talking about it right now. It's just
Okay.
Yeah, but anyway, it's look, I had some fun with it. I thought the themes in it were very interesting, but also just stuff in there. You're sort of like, well, why is this going on? Pretty much, it's, one of the main characters is like a immortal vampire princess with a love interest, but she looks like she's 12. It's just one of those weird sort of things that I went into a rabbit hole in when I was like, yeah, about 2 a.m. So that
Interesting.
was the thing. But I've had vampires on the brain lately. Is my point basically? I've been very interested in looking back into that sort of stuff. Vampires and pirates have both been on the brain a lot of late for some reason.
Damn.
I watched all three of the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, or the second and third.
I figured that you were going to say that. Honestly, I was like, I was going to say, yeah, did you watch Pirates of the Caribbean again or something?
I went through and watched the second and third ones because I never saw them from start to finish, and yeah, I just remembered how awesome those films are. I really like, quite enjoy those. The first one's obviously the original and the best, but there's the second two also like they've got their own sort of
I've only seen
flavor.
the first one. That's it. That's it. I haven't seen the others. I was told not to watch the others.
Third are kind of how you're going, but there's still like there's a lot of fun stuff in there.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think it was back when I'm not going to like make some grandiose sort of overarching statement, but I think that it's just got that swashbuckling set piece lunacy, like all that kind of fun, that you just get from like those sort of movies, pre sort of 2013, 2014. Like these are all coming out in the sort of 2000s and stuff, and it was kind of the business back then. And yeah, I really enjoyed those. So yeah, that was cool. So pirates, pirates and vampires been on the brand lately, dude. Yeah. Anyway, so that's been my sort of last couple of weeks. It's been pretty good.
Nice.
Can't complain. All right, dude. So what do you want to talk about?
Yeah. If the will of God will let us talk about things in this episode, so there's one topic that I definitely want to talk about. I feel like I have to talk about it because
Yep.
it came to my mind when I was listening back to the previous episodes while editing them. So I think like a few episodes ago I might have said this or like talked about this, and I want to go back and kind of like readdress a few things about it because I think it's very important. I do want to preface this with like there won't be spoilers in what I'm about to talk about, so
Yep.
anyone listening doesn't need to worry about spoilers. But a few episodes ago, I think I was talking about Attack on Titan, and it was before the series was finished, and I was talking about it and saying how I thought it was fantastic and how it had the makings of one of the like best manga animes ever. It is finished, and I massively disagree with that now. I think the ending is dog shit, and it has ruined a lot I like about the series. And
Okay.
that made me think about how we might perceive endings, like the both you and I, and how we view endings and how important they are in like a narrative sense. And I thought it'd be fun to kind of talk about endings and how they can easily just fucking ruin a whole story or easily just like bring you this immense kind of satisfaction. Because there are stories I know of as well where the endings aren't actually horrible. Actually, they're so great that they make the rest of the series greater for me, even if I was kind of indifferent towards them as a whole.
Yeah. Okay. That's a really good one, man.
Because I was listening back and hearing Attack on Titan, I was like, oh wow, I massively disagree with what I'm saying right now. Because yeah,
That's fair.
I know where that ending is like a case of just because I think the Attack on Titan ending. I won't spoil anything because I don't want to spoil it, and the anime's coming out soon, so it'd be a bad thing to spoil it because there'll be people waiting for it. But like, essentially, that is a bad ending in the sense that I personally think it goes against everything that was established for characters and built up until that point, and it kind
Yep.
of really ruins a lot of the progress and development that had been really well laid out up until that point. I don't think the ending's bad enough that it ruins the whole series for me. I think there are still good moments in it, and I can still say it's like I'd say it's still an 8 out of 10, but it went from like a 10 to an 8, like with one chapter essentially for me. Like,
Okay. They goofed that hard then.
yeah, it's not a great chapter in my opinion. I'm very much not impressed with its ending.
A 10 from you is very high praise too. Like, I know that you're pretty critical of stuff generally, so yeah. Okay. Damn. Yeah. That's a good topic to get into, man. Okay. My first question will be, well, let's just get down into the sort of basic, I guess, like baseline. What is a good ending? Well, okay, what makes a bad ending? Let's start with that.
I think what I said just then, like going against things that have been established up until that point. Obviously, if you're like kind of going against the point of a character arc, or like if you've established like something up until the ending, and then you've completely gone against that, I think that just leads to inherently bad endings because it's something that hasn't been built up to properly. I also think
Okay.
ending like it needs like I think like an ending needs to be earned as well. Like it's the main thing. You need like that's the, like kind of like the gist of what I was saying there. That's it. You need the ending to feel earned. It can't be something like because you can have like a miserable ending and it still feels satisfying and like a good ending for a story. It's not necessarily that like it has to be a happy ending, especially for me. I do not need a happy ending to be satisfied. Um, but
Yeah, okay, I got you.
I do think it needs to be consistent with what was established up until that point, and it needs to feel earned and like that it was like consistent with what has been established up until that point. I don't doubt that maybe there's a way to do endings that aren't consistent and come out of nowhere and can be satisfying. I haven't personally seen any and can't think of any, but if people have some that want to leave them in the comments, please feel free. Without spoilers, I guess.
No, endings are a tough one to talk about in a lot of senses because, like, just by the nature of them, you will spoil
Yeah,
just about
exactly.
everything, right? So obviously we can just put in the notes, like we're going to be talking about endings of different things because I always think
anything we spoil, I'll put in the descriptions.
no, I think that like let's like, just talk about it though. So what you've just said is essentially like if you were saying arcs, but do you mean like with
Do you mean what? Sorry, can you repeat that? You cut out of it.
character arcs? Do you mean
Character arcs.
character arcs?
I think, yeah, character arcs is kind of more what I'm talking about because I'm thinking of Attack on Titan. But I do think that there can be things established in the world where you need to be consistent with that for an ending as well and not have things kind of come out of nowhere. In particular, I think if in your ending you're introducing new elements, there's no fucking way in hell your ending is going to be good. I can't really see an ending being good if there are just new elements being thrown in like minutes before the end of the story.
Yeah, okay, I hear. I was also going to ask, like, when you say ending, do you mean like the absolute total resolution of an entire story, or do you mean like us? Are we allowing for sequel hooks here? Are we allowing for like an ending that opens up the possibility of more, or do we mean like a total finale of an entire series, franchise, whatever?
I think there's room to talk for both. I was thinking more like final ending, but I think sequel hooks can be discussed in their own merit as well because there's definitely aspects to consider when it comes to sequel hooks and endings because sometimes they can be good sequel hooks, like they can lead into something, they can leave things open in a satisfying way. Like I think I said that I'm kind of iffy on like the Sherlock Holmes one ending because I don't like Sherlock Holmes 2 as much, but I do think leaving Moriarty open is a good sequel hook and is a kind of good ambiguous ending to leave it on.
Yep, that's it.
Yeah, but I do think there are probably like there's obviously some sequel hooks where it's like, well, we don't need another sequel, like or anything. Like I don't think the Sherlock Holmes 2 ending being left open and ambiguous is that great. I'd rather it be a bit more concrete, but
Yeah.
yeah, so I think sequel hooks have their own like merits to them and different things going for them because obviously there's some Hollywood movies that are just left open ended and it's like, oh well, fucking no one wants another one, like, or like it's just leaving it open so that Hollywood can make more money. That's kind of what's inherently bad about sequel hooks is that they are left open because if this movie performs well, we can make another one and make more money.
No, I hear you. Well, let's talk about finales then. I think that'll be a just for the scope of this particular discussion. I think finales is a better thing to talk.
Keep it on brand.
Yeah, I can't really think of like specific examples right now of like fantastic finales to long running series. I can think of some really good ones, but like let's go with bad again. So what you're saying that character arcs if they're not resolved or if the character ultimately does not find itself in a sort of good stead and they don't finish up like if say let's say for instance a character's been developed a whole different kind of way and they hit an end point and then it doesn't or the character then like throws away everything that they've learned and struggled for throughout the entire series. That's a bad ending.
In my opinion, it is. I can see how maybe it could be done well. In the case of Attack on Titan, I don't think it's done well at all, like how they do it. But I think like if you're trying to develop your character and you set them to be going down one route, it just feels very contradictory if at the last second they turn around and like, well, no, actually this. And it's like, okay, well, what was like it feels kind of pointless that you've been building up this character the whole time then. And yeah, I need to get my head away from Attack on Titan so I can focus on the ending topic a bit more. But I do think you need your character arcs to feel consistent. You want your characters if you're having a character arc and you're making your character build up to something, you want the ending to feel like an actual like a natural conclusion of what they've been building up to. Like that character arc is kind of essential. Actually, I can think of an example of a good one where it's good and it kind of enhances the whole story for me.
Okay.
SSS Gridman is one for me, where I'm pretty happy with the show as a whole, but then the ending and specifically for Akane's character arc, I think is immensely satisfying and enhances the whole experience for me. Like, and
Yeah.
going through it over and over again, I enjoy seeing Akane's growth and what leads to the finale of the episode, because it feels like a natural conclusion of her character arc, and the characters actually helping her grow as a person as well.
Yeah. No, I see that one, man. That's a good example. I'm trying to think of more bad ones, and I'm sure there's plenty of them.
Yeah, let me just fucking go
Um,
on any any like fucking entertainment website and look at like some series, and I'm sure I'll have problems with the endings.
it's hard to talk about ultimate finales though, purely because like, this is just a side note, but it is something interesting that you were talking about earlier. Like for big grand finales, it's quite tough to think of like long running series that have actually come to an end and have closed up and have been done. I've heard a lot about I don't know this, but Tokyo Ghoul's ending apparently was not that great. I don't know how it ends,
It
but
was not that great at all, and I think it's more because of the author's fatigue than anything else. But yeah, it was not a great ending.
okay. So and again, it might just be it was rushed, or some elements weren't tied up, or it was it was lacking some things. But yeah, as a side note, like if we're talking about like something like anime, for instance, or video games, although they don't really have endings per se either. Movies, I suppose, are probably the best, like a big long running series. And even then, there's always these sequel hooks. There's always this. There's always that. There's
Yeah,
always what's going on. And somewhere, for instance, Pirates of the Caribbean, the third Pirates of the Caribbean, the way it wraps up is like it's a pretty good ending. It's a pretty good finale for the whole series. But because Hollywood, they had to go back and make another two of them.
yeah,
So and then kind of balk that in a lot of sectors. Like a lot of those payoffs and everything that sort of resolved the way it did. Yeah, it lacked a bit of punch and finale if you keep making stuff afterwards. So just as a side note, for an ultimate finale, you either it's one of two things, really, isn't it? It's like you have to be in a situation where you've been with your characters for quite a while, and all their arcs wrap up and they resolve quite nicely, and there's a good sort of punch and there's a good end to it, as opposed to a bit open ended, and it could go one way, it could go another. Where you're leaving it open for sequels, it's quite tough to sort of talk about like a proper finale for it. I hear Game of Thrones is the same. Not that I've seen it,
I
I
haven't
wouldn't know
seen it
anything about.
either, and I can't say anything.
Yeah, there we go. So best not to talk about that. But yeah, I can't really think of like a long running series that I've been in love with forever. I can think of a couple, but where the ending doesn't. I mean, I would say I don't know if you ever read Aragon.
I have not finished Aragon. I have read like most of it though.
Yeah, Aragon had a weird ending to it, man. It didn't feel all that satisfying to me at all. A good chunk of it was just like the way it ended, the way all the character arcs sort of wrapped up, and what happened and when it happened, the way it did. It felt like it was pretty severely lacking in just yeah. It felt like it would cut short a lot of the character development, and past a certain point, the author just wanted, just to get it over with, and he wanted to get it done, and that was as simple as it was. I think because it was like, well, there was some cool premises, and there was some really cool scenes, there was some good stuff in it, and that series has its own problems, man. There's nothing saying it doesn't. Like it's got some issues, and why it was really cool to hate on it, but it didn't seem to really have like a very good sort of put together ending, and I felt like it was pretty lackluster because a lot of the arcs you're expecting to build up to, um, yeah, it just didn't sort of resolve the way it should have. I felt, and it didn't feel satisfying. And so I think that's because of exactly what you were talking about. It introduced new elements right at the sort of end of it, which was kind of okay. What's going on here? The character arcs inside of it didn't seem to wrap up or finish up all that well. And I think ultimately as well, this is another big one: is if you're building up a villain. I think this is like this ties in with character arcs and everything else. But if you're building up a villain to be the most dangerous, like sort of crazy overpowered, like how are they going to get out of this one, how they're going to beat this guy, and how's it all going to sort of happen, and then it's the payoff's not satisfying, or it just feels like it came out of nowhere. The trope term is what we call ass pull.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah,
Out of nowhere, and you're like, well, what happened here? How did this all sort of go down, and how did it finish up in the end ultimately?
yeah.
Um,
Villains,
first question,
villains actually are an interesting aspect to endings because yeah, depending on how you build it up, like if you build up a villain as being something like overly strong, and then like you get to the matter of like, oh, well, how do we stop them? I actually have something I want to say about villains, but I do want to say first that I personally think in terms of writing narratives, I think that endings are like the hardest aspects to pull off, in my opinion. They are especially for long running series. The longer you go on, the harder it gets to pull off because you get more you get more readers, you get more people that are invested in the story, and people all want the things to go in different ways. They'll be expecting different things. Not everyone will have the same idea of how the series should end. Like for a series, it's not going to happen. People are going to have different favorite characters. They're going to have different preferences for what they want. The longer a series goes on, it gets harder. For manga, especially, I think it's really difficult because there's multiple aspects to it. You got to consider like the format of how it's being released, like once per week, and you don't have time to really flesh out things properly like each week, or you have to like think it out for week by week by week, and then when you get to the ending, you probably got like a massive fan base, and then people pissed off because one character didn't get with another character or something, and everyone had a different idea of it, especially when it comes to villains of a lot of manga, because a lot of like shonen villains end up becoming super powerful and like or like really unstoppable, and some series fall into the trap of hyping them up too much, and then when they actually get to it, they're like, oh well, fuck, how do we beat them in a satisfying way? And a lot of time with shonen, people would say that they don't. I know people feel that way with Demon Slayer. I'm kind of the opposite opinion, where I think the way they handled the villain was actually pretty well done, and like it felt kind of satisfying with how hyped up they were that they went the route they did. I know some people disagree with that, but that's my opinion. Actually, there is like one other one I can think of. Have you watched or read Death Note?
No.
Okay. Well, I think that the way, like, I know a lot of people hate the second half of the series. I will state that I don't like the second half, but I do think the final episode is actually really, really good in my opinion, and it feels like it kind of earned and it's a satisfactory defeat of like the antagonist, quote unquote. And yeah, I think there are obviously exceptions. Like there are times where people can plan around it, but I do think with the villain aspect, and especially considering their play in part in the endings of a series, you definitely fall into this trap of like you need to consider how you build up the villain the whole way through, because if you build up your villain as something completely strong and unstoppable, and like you hype them up so much to the point where they're like almost it's impossible to see how they could be beaten, then you fall into this risk of like, well, how are they going to get beaten? And My Hero Academia is currently falling into that trap, actually, with its main villain. I'd say that right now the main villain's getting way too strong, and it's kind of getting really concerning as to how they can actually beat the villain.
Yeah, I got you.
And I think for villains especially, it falls more into shonen. I feel like I see a lot of shonens where the main villain is hyped up so much, and then you get to the end, and it's like not a satisfying fight at all. It's like, well, they got hyped up way too much. Obviously, they can't do this or this because they just win automatically.
No, I got you. And that power level scaling is it's always been an issue in shonen, I think.
Yes.
I felt like it's always quite hard if you're going to build up a villain like throughout, multiple iterations or multiple seasons or something. You sort of hit this end point where you're like, well, damn, how do we kind of finish this up? Like, how are we actually going to bring this up to be satisfying? And then more to the point, like, is it going to continue on after this? Is there just a new arc with a new villain, new stuff going on? And I think that just comes down to the episodic nature of manga and long running series generally.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know about One Piece, right? I know that it's huge and it's been going on forever. Like, I can't even imagine how that series is going to end.
Yeah, One Piece will be interesting. There's no way everyone will love its ending. I think but I'm gonna like have a controversial opinion here as well. I don't think some people want shonens to have a good ending, and that's like that also branches into other stories. Some people just don't want series to have a good ending, and they'll complain about anything. I'm gonna be cynical and say that I do think people definitely do that. There are some endings that are obviously bad and do have bad aspects, but I do think with shonen especially, I see a lot of people complaining about stuff, and I'm like, it feels like you guys just want to complain for the sake of complaining, but it is also got its problems. But One Piece, it's got such a gathering and such a fan base now that there's just no possible way it'll be a satisfying ending for everyone.
I think that's just the nature of the long running series as a whole, man. I have this feeling that, like, if you've been invested in something for, let's say, 700 episodes or whatever it is, like, you almost can't stop.
Yeah.
You need to keep going. Like, let's say it's your livelihood or whatever else. Like, if you end this, if you have to find a way to end it and to finish it, it's never going to satisfy anybody. And like, people just want more and more and more and more of it. They want a reboot. They want a sequel series. They want this. They want that. They want something else. I know nothing about Naruto, for instance, but I know that there was an ending. I assume there was an ending to it, and then they just went, okay, cool, now Naruto's son.
Yeah, there was an ending. Naruto also falls into that problem of like they hyped up their villain too much, and then they had to beat them in an unsatisfying way. Naruto's ending sucks.
I don't know. I think that as a rule, or just again once again get back to the principles, or just the sort of basic things that make endings bad. I would just to reiterate. I think that you're right about like if character arcs aren't like tied off like in a satisfying manner. If the character's motivation is suddenly replaced
Yeah.
or it's changed, or it just feels like something came out of nowhere and then changed the entire scope and the game of narrative, I think it suffers. I think that, and I'll add in. I think if there's been a, let's say, for instance, it's a villain. If the villain's ending is unsatisfying, or they don't, they're built up to be too much of a threat, it's not believable that these, mere mortals can beat this villain.
Yeah.
Likewise, the pushover, it's also no fun,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like I think the main antagonistic force has to be defeated in such a way that it finishes up the hero's arc, but it also provides like a satisfying ending to that villain. Particularly if people really like that villain for any number of reasons, right?
Yes.
So there's that. I think those are two big aspects. I think the other one is the notion of the ass pull of the suddenly there's all these new elements introduced, or there's like a sudden new layer, or there's just like the 11th hour superpower. Something comes out of left field, the hero suddenly can grab hold of it at the last second, and no one knows anything about this. There's no narrative. There's nothing in the narrative to suggest that it was there in the first place, and this kind of comes out of nowhere. And that's really disappointing and lame too, because you're like, well, hang on, what? Like, can you explain? Can we like what? It's unsatisfying because it hasn't been built up, and you don't get to look back and go, oh, I saw this coming because of X, Y, or Z.
Yeah.
And I think that that's where a series will really start to suffer as well. So those are my sort of three aspects that I can think of immediately where I reckon that an ending will not be satisfying, particularly a finale style ending, like the grand finale, if all of those things happen. You're going to run into issues as well. Like, let's say, for instance, if you kill off particular characters just out of the blue, this is one thing I really do not much care for. Now, this is again like it depends on how you frame the narrative. Because if you've already established the story, let's say Attack on Titan, for instance, if you've already established a story where this is a dangerous world with anyone can die, it's a brutal, unrelenting world and super rough. People can die left, right, and center. No one has plot armor. If that's already been established, then okay. Well, I can understand that. I imagine it's similar with like Game of Thrones or Walking Dead or whatever. But at the same time, if you're just killing things off for shock value and to provide certain, just to say, oh, this is the danger of the new villain. He's just killed his beloved character off, and like that's incredibly frustrating and annoying too.
Yeah.
And I think randomly killing off a character where like there's no foreshadowing, there's no sort of application, and that character's arc gets cut short before they can ultimately achieve something, or they don't go out like a boss. It's a classic like stay. I'll stay behind and hold off the zombie horde. Just give me some ammo, and I got you guys covered. And that guy goes down, and it's like, well, that's a satisfying arc for that character because they've hit a certain sort of threshold. And now they're going to spill over into, well, I'm going to sacrifice myself for the good of the people. And, they've either got a redemption arc going on or it's a sacrificial arc or those, like, there's certain narrative elements that make those characters dying, like, a satisfying and fitting end to that character. But if you just kill them off for the shock value or to establish the threat of the new situation that's just sort of turned up, it feels incredibly unsatisfying and irritating, really.
Yeah.
And that's an ending too, I think.
Yeah, shock value, like character deaths, can be really fucking bad. I do think there are ways they can be good, but a lot of the time, I am kind of getting tired of the trope of like having a strong character get killed off by like a new villain just to kind of establish them as a villain. It is something that's getting a bit tiring for me. I used to like it a lot. I do not like it that much anymore. Whenever it happens, I'm kind of like, all right, cool. I roll like, all right, yeah, cool. This is the new villain, awesome. I actually think on the topic of like killing characters off for fucking shock value as well. That's like one of my biggest problems with Harry Potter's final book as well. Like just the like ending book, so they just kill off a bunch of characters because there's now like no need for no need to worry about like consequences after the book or anything. So just kill off a bunch of characters. I do kind of dislike that trope when it comes to ending things where it's like, oh, there's nothing else after this, so we can kill off whoever we want. And then a lot of the time it ends up feeling kind of just like a Harry Potter especially. I remember when I read it like years ago when I was like younger, even then, and like before I had like a critical opinion on stuff and that. I remember even reading it and just not really feeling that affected by any of the deaths or anything because it was just so like constant that I was like, well, I don't really care. Like I like a lot of these characters, but these deaths just feel so out of place, and like they're just being mentioned so like one by one, and I'm just kind of like, well, I don't care. Like, really, it's the end of the book. I know I'm not going to see like the consequences of these characters' deaths. I'm not going to see anyone grieving about them or anything.
Yeah.
It's a trope that I don't like a lot, and I feel like some books do it where when they get to the end, they're like, well, we need to go all out for the ending, so let's just fucking go all out, and because the series is ending, let's just kill a bunch of characters because we don't need to worry about popularity anymore or like anything after that. And I think if you have that mindset with a story, it's just inherently going to be unsatisfying because it just feels like you're throwing aside all these character arcs you built up just so that the readers can be shocked and be like, whoa, this is really endgame now. It's like, cool.
No, I agree, man. I 100% agree with that, and I think that's just.
Oh.
Yeah, I think that's a poor way to end a novel. I think those are the things that all lead to a pretty bad ending, in my opinion. Yeah, I have issues. I have issues with that. I think those are all like those are the sort of things that I can identify as being a pretty poor way to end a story, especially for a finale sort of thing.
Yeah.
I'm just like racking my brain trying to think of like a massive finale that I've seen that I really disliked for a number of reasons. But I can't think of any off the top of my head.
Yeah, at the top of my head, I can't think of any either. Like, I can't really think of a lot of endings where I actually finished it and was like, that was immensely satisfying and I'm good. I'm really happy with that ending. A lot of the time it ends and I'm just like, yeah, that was an ending. It was good. Like, there are very few
Yeah,
endings where I'm like, just kind of blown away and like, whoa, that was like fantastic. And a lot of the time when the endings are really good, I love the series or the like actual piece as a whole much more because I know what it builds up to. Especially endings where like revisiting them, you can like have bigger payoffs just because you can see the build up towards the ending. That's like really good as well, in my opinion.
yeah. Okay, so what makes a good ending then? I mean, I just hazard a guess it's the inverse of what we were just
Yeah,
talking about.
I think from the get go, to have a good ending, you should probably draw it like have mapped out where the series is going to end before you start writing it. Like if you go into a series and don't know where it's ending, I think you're already kind of inherently playing with fire. Like you should probably know how a series is going to end, in my opinion.
Yep, I can see that. I can also, but there are people who can write by the seat of their pants. Like we know,
Obviously, yeah.
I know there's plenty of people who've managed to sort of push it all together, and then the ultimate ending of it was actually really satisfying because they paid attention to all the loops that they left open, and they managed to tie them all off in a really satisfying sort of climactic, cathartic
Yeah.
finish. And I love those. You know, I love when that happens. Like I can think of a number of really good endings for anime that I know. For instance, I would say like Code Geass, the original series of
Yeah.
Code Geass, satisfying ending.
Yeah, Code Geass' ending is fucking amazing. It's so amazing that you kind of forget like a lot of the shortcomings of the show.
Yeah, and that's what you were talking about earlier when you said like an ending is so good that you can actually sort of overlook some of the stuff in there that you're like, this is a bit weird,
Yeah,
and see how it together. Another one's Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood.
I have not watched it, unfortunately. I need to watch it.
I'll just say if you're gonna get into that, watch Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. It's a 60 episode anime. I think it's one of the best stories I've ever seen, just put together in anime like across the board, and I really enjoy the ending to it. Fantastic ending. I think the resolution of everything is really good. It feels like the payoff's fantastic, and there's just so much to it that's awesome. And the fact that they never felt the need to revisit it and do a sequel is even better. Like
Yeah,
I
just
really
give it a
like
few years.
Tokyo. They tried to make like
Oh,
sequels, and
those movies suck. Oh my god, I actually watched them recently. They suck so hard. They're awful. They're like that like sequel movie that came out recently is absolutely garbage. It's so just pure fan service.
yeah, I'm not a fan of that, and that's like it's the same with the Pirates of the Caribbean thing, right? Like you could have tied it off and ended it where you did, and it was what it was. But there's also again like Pirates of the Caribbean 3 had a sequel hook to it, and they were going to make another movie after that. You could tell,
Yeah.
because they're just money off it. But yeah, like there are series, there are animes that are like anime move like just anime generally that I can think of that had fantastic endings to them, and that
Yeah.
were really good and they're really satisfying. And I think that's because the character arc's finished. And more specifically, I think the main character arcs and most of the main supporting characters, if they all have like a satisfying sort of end to their arc, then that is like the best that can happen.
Yeah. Definitely.
For me, ultimately, I think that is the greatest sort of end to everything. I think that when that all comes together, when that all finishes up, that is the business. I think that's when you get those chills, man. You get that catharsis off it. I think it's a character resolution. I think that the other thing with it too is internal consistency, which is what we were talking about earlier with the Arsepool thing. It's all been built up to be one crazy climactic ending, and it pays off, and it's all consistent, and you're not going to see it coming because a good artist will put it all together in such a way where it will come together and it'll be beautiful and big and it'll be consistent. I think that's you've tied off all the arcs and you've done it in a way where people don't feel like you've cheated them.
Yes.
I think that's a huge element of it all, and I think that's super important. So that'll be another one for me that I think's super like really really important for a good ending in any story. I don't know why I'm thinking of anime like specifically as being.
I think because I mentioned Attack on Titan, like probably, and like so at the start, so that's like we kind of just got sidetracked of that.
No, but I think it's also just a good example generally because those tend to be really long running series with a lot of juice to them that have a lot of that have a lot going on for them. That's super important too, right? Yeah, I think those can be really good examples of it. That's one that I think of. Like anime as a whole, particularly long running series, when they have a good payoff, man, it's worth the wait, it's worth the time. When they're not getting dragged in for shitty sequel movies, that's fantastic. Yeah, so internal consistency, character arcs, and just I think catharsis, man. Catharsis is always going to be the most important aspect of any ending of a story. It's got to feel. It's got to feel. It's got to make you feel something. And whether or not that's happy, it's sad, it's bittersweet, it's strong, it's soft, it's whatever it is. It's got to have a good conclusion to it, and there's multiple layers to this. I think let's say for instance it's a struggle. It's a combative situation between an antagonist and a protagonist. I think the protagonist has got to triumph over the antagonist. You got to feel like the protagonist hasn't cheated. You got to feel like the antagonist has been defeated like fairly, and you've also got to feel like the antagonist has let this happen to themselves in such a way. They've gone out of their way to in search of ultimate power or ultimate this or ultimate that, and they've ultimately failed, and the protagonist has triumphed. But it's still got to feel like the antagonist is a Byronic, hero of their own story in a way, and that's got to be a really important aspect. Another one might be like a romantic comedy, ultimately, or a romance generally. Ultimately, for it to be a cathartic finish or a cathartic end, you need to have the two main sort of get together. That's like so that a satisfying ending needs to have a good romantic tie-up. Your main characters who are either sides of that romance need to get together. That's super important. Yeah, there's any other number of things, but I think that's a really big one.
Yeah, there are different things you need to consider for like different genres. Obviously, like not every genre has the same things that you need for a good ending. Like we've said it enough with like shonen like for this episode, I think. But obviously, like you need to consider how the main characters will triumph, obviously. But yeah, I think the rom-com thing was a good thing to bring up as well because a good romantic comedy is one that like obviously it feels like the relationship's being built up to and earned by the end of it, or if it's like a cynical romantic comedy or something that like the relationship being not built up feels earned, I guess. It's just all product of like the build up. And I think any of my favorite series, I would say, were successfully built up to for the ending. Like I think that any series that I inherently love and say is my favorite, I probably think the ending is great. Like 28 Days Later, for example, I think the ending's fantastic. I think it builds up to the ending perfectly and establishes Jim's character right at the not right at the end, but like it builds up his character up until the end point, and then when the ending actually happens, it feels like a satisfying payoff for all the growth he's undergone and the themes of the film. And then that final shot and like just all three of them like happy and like they're like outside of the military base is just a really satisfying and cathartic ending, like you were saying.
Yeah, it makes it because it's tied everything together, and it's still ultimately ambiguous. But the way it ends up and the way it finishes is the most important thing.
Yeah.
I would also like while we're talking about you could say romance or you could say like a combative sort of a revenge plot or whatever the case may be. I would also say the same of tragedy, man. I think that's super important. So a big one is like tragedy. His hero is always going to be a bit Byronic. There's that classic trope of the Byronic hero. That Lelouch is an excellent example of this in Code Geass. He's a Byronic hero. He's flawed. He's angry. He's got issues. He does really questionable, scary shit in pursuit of his goals, and ultimately he pays the ultimate price for that. and that's why it feels satisfying. That's why it feels like a good ending. Is because like if you're gonna have a character who will do almost literally anything in pursuit of their goals, there needs to be like some recompense. There needs to be a balancing of the karmic scales, if you will. And I think that's a big part of catharsis. So let's say, for instance, that when we're talking about things being earned, I think that's a big part of it.
Yeah.
I think that the satisfying payoff of a good ending is it's not inversely, it's always going to be proportionate to the amount of suffering and trial and like just hardship that the main characters will suffer through to get to that endpoint. So for instance, a really good romance is going to have all kinds of obstacles thrown in the way of the main two people. They're going to be, there'll be misunderstandings. There might be love triangle. There might be this. There might be that. There might be outside factors. There might be family tension. There might be any other number of things. And those are all super, those are all super like big obstacles throughout the course of the story. But ultimately, the thing that brings it all together is their love for each other, and that triumph. True love triumphs over all. And then when they finally get together in that one massive climactic moment, whether it be the kiss or sort of that wedding day or whatever it is, that is when it feels the best. Is when you know they've earned that because they have gone through the required amount or the proportionate amount of hardship to get to that goal. I think it's the same when you beat a good villain, dude. Good
Yeah.
villains are Byronic heroes of their own story. I've said this before, but the best villains you can think of are the guys who have fallen from grace and do anything in the pursuit of their own goals. And ultimately, they pay the price for that. And the villains, I think some of the best villains are the ones that you feel a twinge of sympathy for when they go down.
Yes, yeah, I agree.
Or you go down that road where ultimately the heroes are focused on good and they're like ability to hold their morals. They turn, like the Darth Vader example is the classic one, right? It's at the very last moment, Darth Vader, overcome by love for his son, turns back towards the light and actually defeats the sort of biggest, bad guy throughout the whole thing. I think that those are the most cathartic and like fitting endings to those stories, and we remember Darth Vader because of that, right? Like we remember he, in the last pocket, in the very last moment, overcome by love for his son and his son's mercy towards him. Then ultimately, he sacrifices himself and he has his moment of redemption. And there's like catharsis has so many different elements to it, dude. I think like redemption's a big one, right? So we like this in our heroes. We like when a hero or a villain can be redeemed ultimately.
Mm-hmm.
Likewise, we like it when a hero overcomes impossible odds. The underdog, the classic underdog story, where they finish up and then like they've hit that sort of end point, and they've gone through the valley of the shadow of death. They've gone through the whole hero's journey, and now they've earned what that is, whether it be the princess of the kingdom or they've slain the dragon and the princess of the kingdom, and now they become like they enter into their own sort of kingship. That kind of catharsis is the best in my opinion. So I think what makes the best endings is having just tied into what you're talking about with character arcs, but having the main characters or the heroes or whatever you will of the story earn the happy ending. You
Yeah.
have to. I think that's the biggest thing for me, man. And as a result, I don't tend to like tragedies are really good, but the tragedies can be really good. Sorry, but I think with tragedy, you need to have a protagonist who has nobility. They need to be noble. They need to have a sort of a level of lines they will not cross. They ultimately still do pay the price for their sins, which makes it that bittersweet ending where they pay for it with their life.
Yeah.
They exile afterwards or whatever happens. I think that the most important thing for those kinds of tragedies, the bittersweet endings, is that it's still a payoff and there's still there's a sense or a smell of redemption in the air.
Yeah.
Side characters ultimately triumph, or they ultimately are able to carry that Byronic heroes, that victory forward, and then the world becomes a better place, or whatever the case may be. I
Yeah.
think those are the most important elements of any good story, and I think that this is a sort of general rant. I think that there's been a general lack of this in a lot of modern film, and just modern writing generally. I think the whole idea of deconstructing the earn your happy ending, deconstructing the fairy tale tropes, deconstructing that catharsis, and the whole it's all done in the name of, well, we need to make people think, or we want to make this more gritty and realistic. I think that it still ultimately fails to have that kind of punch right at the end. That's why I think a lot of sort of more modern stuff is pretty forgettable.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a bit I can say on like bittersweet endings and kind of like tragic endings, but before that I kind of want to go back a bit just before we get too far away from it, and then we'll finish with like the kind of unsatisfying endings aspects because there's a lot I can say there. So this is going to end up being a bit further than I want. But you said something that made me think of something. Because you said you want like the overcoming of villains to be satisfying, and then that immediately made me think of video games and like final boss fights and all that. And I think I just kind of want to briefly touch on that because there's a small thing that I want to say there. Whereas with video games, there's that aspect of like you don't just have to consider the writing when it comes to the ending. You have to consider the actual gameplay elements of the ending as well and how satisfying it is to actually overcome that villain. DMC is like the thing that comes to my mind immediately where like in DMC 3 the final boss fight is this satisfying kind of payoff of like testing everything you've learned up until that point in the game. And if you've actually learned and overcome all the obstacles and have like adapted to the game and gotten good, you get this satisfying boss fight where once you overcome it, you feel relieved and like you actually earned the ending. And I think for video games, especially like action games like that or like kind of fighting oriented games, you need to have that kind of satisfying feel when you like overcome like the final boss of the game because they are the final obstacle. They're what you've built up to, and it should be a payoff of what you've learnt up until that point. I just really wanted to say that because once you said that thing about overcoming villains, it immediately came to my mind, and I didn't want to forget about it.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I mean, I think this is one of the reasons why, in some senses, the sort of Dark Souls or the Soulsborne games, just as a side note, they're an example of this. Mechanically, they're very difficult, and knowing your character, knowing when to move, learning the process, coming back at it again and again and again, and not giving up. You feel like you're going through your own sort of training montage and your own, own hardships. And when you beat that boss finally, you get a huge dopamine dump.
Yeah.
That's not necessarily a story thing, but it's almost like you've gone through your own little training arc. You've gone through your own character arc just in the process of trying to beat that boss.
Yeah.
And yet, the boss should always be the ultimate test of your understanding of the game mechanics. And ideally, it's a good story wrap up too, right?
Yes, yeah. It's just an interesting aspect I wanted to bring up because I think with video games, yeah, there's like a whole layer that you have to consider when like it comes to the endings, and especially for DMC 3, I think it has a really satisfying kind of payoff with like the final boss fight. Some of the other DMC games have good boss fights as well, but like actually I said some of the other games, but I'd probably only say DMC 5 has like a really good kind of satisfying one that rivals 3. One's boss fight isn't that great at the end. I'll bring us back to kind of the unsatisfying kind of like, well, not unsatisfying, but bittersweet ending because there's also like another kind of there is a kind of art in how you make an unsatisfying ending satisfying as well, because I do think that lately like modern movies do have a kind of more cynical kind of gritty approach when it comes to endings, where you see a lot more endings that are kind of just intentionally miserable. I'm the cynical fucking miserable piece of shit that I am. So obviously I love endings that are like that, but I do think that you need to have that kind of earned feeling for it. Like one of the prime examples I can think of is like BoJack Horseman, where I would say its ending isn't incredibly like happy or anything. It's very bittersweet, but it's a very satisfying bittersweet ending where I feel like that's the only way it could have ended. Whereas if it had a happy ending, I would have felt just completely disappointed in the series and wouldn't have liked the ending as a whole. There are some movies I can think of as well. I think Midsummer's ending is very, very dark and like kind of fucking frightening, like how it ends. But I think it's a fantastic ending that is a payoff to everything that was established in the movie. And it's like the inverse, where like the character arc is actually like a character arc leading to their own demise instead of like leading to their own success. But in its own way, that's satisfying because it feels like the movie or show has built up to that. And there's definitely been an increase in films and entertainment leading up to kind of more cynical, jaded endings. But I think that there are a lot that don't actually build up to it well enough, and they just have a kind of sad ending just to kind of be sad. And that's where my problem is with it. I don't want to like give off the image that I just like sad and miserable endings. I like it when they feel earned, and you do need to earn them as well. You can't just be like, I'm just going to give the series a miserable ending because that's what it deserves. Sometimes that's not the approach you should take, and having a miserable ending won't just make everyone happy. Like they won't be like, oh yes, this is like a different and kind of unique ending. It's no longer unique to have miserable or sad or bittersweet endings. You've got to actually earn it.
I think that's the difference between good and bad writing, though, man.
Yeah.
When we get down, I think that this actually ties in really nicely to what I wanted to pick your brain about. So this is mathematically speaking. No,
Okay.
we'll get that. I'll get to that in a minute. But what I think, it's yeah, like you need. I think another thing we might even add into the layer of like satisfying character arcs. Like I think a big part of it's tone as well, because if you set the tone for, let's say, a horror movie, where ultimately the heroes are flawed and they're being punished for their sins or whatever the case may be, which is the sort of case, or there's this monster that has this kind of desire, has the thing that it wants. You will like, if the monster just kills everybody and that's the end of it, you kind of don't feel really good about that.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, it's scary, and yeah, the monster's still loose and this stuff's still happening, but it still feels like a cop out.
Yeah.
Watching a horror movie where, well, let's take The Grudge for instance. This is a good example. Like the way that ends is terrifying, and it's very ambiguous, and it's weird because in a lot of senses it doesn't follow the same kind of narrative steps that the rest of it does. In regular horror, I mean. So with the characters in The Grudge, most of them haven't done anything wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the victims of the ghosts haven't done anything wrong. They were just in the wrong place at the wrong time, or they're in certain places they shouldn't have been. And there's these vengeful ghosts that are going around, eating people or destroying them or killing them or doing whatever else. But it's ultimately pushing back towards the curses themselves, the ghosts and the cursed creatures that haunt this house. And it's talking about the tragedy and the misery of those things. And it sort of further drives home just how messed up and just how cooked the lives of those, those ghosts were in life, like how those people were in life. And it sort of just drills home the tragedy and the sort of the horror of it all, if you will.
Yeah.
I think that's not a bad approach to take. Even if innocents are being knocked off left, right, and center, you still feel as if it is the tragedy of this particular ghostly family that have turned into flesh-eating ghouls or whatever it is that and killing people who have been involved in this sort of whole area. And it does add to the horror aspect, but it's still, again, it just focuses on the tragedy of those particular people and what happened. And I think that's better. And it's the same, for instance, like the classic sort of the Friday 13th thing. Like you got a bunch of dumb teenagers who are just out there to do drugs and they're hedonistic and they're doing whatever they're doing. Like they're victims and they're fodder for Jason Voorhees. But push comes to shove, like they're not very good people getting eaten. And so in a sense, it's kind of a moral lesson. It does drive home, yes, the horror of it, but also like the importance of responsibility, just being smart and making the right decisions in the pocket. And that's old hat now. And you could see it as preachy and whatever else you like, but it's still an aspect I think it's very important. I think that's what makes horror movies really good. One of the reasons I like Alien so much or Predator so much, for instance, those are classics, is because at the end, like Ripley does get out of there alive.
Yeah.
Like she goes through some crazy stuff. She's smart. She's tough. She's well written. She's consistently like smarter than everybody else. She takes the threat seriously. She finds ways around it. It's a survival horror, but ultimately she does get away, and it's through her own ingenuity of shooting the thing out of space that like she's able to sort of earn that long moment where she sits down and she's drifting off in an escape pod to wherever else. I think that's super important. I think it's really well done because she's earned that particular bittersweet ending. Like the entire crew's dead and everything's messed up, but the tone of it is like always been this is kind of stuff. And the big reveal that the ship, the crew were only really there, or there was a faceless corporation. Ash is the big part of, right? That's the sort of horror of it all. It's almost not that it's that humans are bastards and the creature that came on board was just part of that whole process.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting.
Horror endings in general are a interesting topic, especially with the evolution of them, because I think horror movies especially have become way more cynical. Like nowadays, where they would just be like a lot more. It's a lot more common that horror movies would be happy to just kill off all of its characters. And I honestly think there is so much I could say about it that if I end up making my YouTube channel, I could probably make a video in of itself just about endings in horror movies, because I think in general it falls into the trap that other movies with cynical endings do, where it's kind of like, yeah, cool, all the characters are dead and all that, but like it's not so unique anymore, and everyone's done it, and especially like now, like in like Friday the 13th, it was fine to like kill off all of its characters essentially because the characters weren't well written and people didn't care about them. Nowadays, though, when people try and actually care about writing the characters and then like all the characters die, it just leaves you with this unsatisfied feeling of like, well, that just wasn't enjoyable. Like I didn't like all these characters die, and there's the argument of like it's trying to be more realistic. You know, good people do die and all that, but there are just some movies where the tone just doesn't. Tone is actually another important thing to consider when it comes to this. How you're presenting the movie and what you present in the ending. If it's very tonally different, then it just leaves this unsatisfying kind of feeling. If a whole film's been built up to be kind of good, like a horror film's been built up to be kind of, some kind of light-hearted slasher kind of fun film or something, like the Friday the 13th, but then it just ends on a kind of sadistic note where it just feels kind of really mean, then you don't feel satisfied. You're kind of like, well, that wasn't fun. But if like a movie's being built up to kind of be a bit more mean and kind of dark and gritty, and then ends on that kind of ending, you can feel a bit more satisfied because it's like, well, it's been built up to. I think tone is actually something we haven't talked about for this whole episode, but that's very important as well.
Yeah, man, I think that's the biggest one, and that's where you avoid the sort of the whole ass pull thing, because if the movie changes towards the end, and this is a big part of it, if it is a pretty like brutal, cynical, rough kind of series or show or whatever, and then right at the end it's all sort of happy clappy and everyone owns the happy endings, and it feels like it's just come out of a fairy tale. It feels stolen. Like you go, hang on a second, how did this all just wind up being okay? The tone of the world is brutal and it's sadistic, and people die for no reason. And then suddenly everyone's sort of turning around and going, "Yeah, we beat the threat and everything else." It's like, well, you've gone into the depths of psychological humanity, and now you've just told me that and they all lived happily ever after. That doesn't set a very good precedent for me, I think. And I found this. This is one of the reasons why. This is just a sort of note on tone generally, but with the third John Wick film, this is just a little I'm about to go on, but it's a very small thing. And what I realized was I was like, why does the third one feel weird? Why does the third one feel like there was just something about the end of it that even like the last sort of couple of fights and everything in the third John Wick. Why does this feel so? Yeah, why does it feel so wrong? Why does it feel like I've been cheated out of something? And I realized what it was. It was the introduction of the that assassin. Remember the guy who's he's cutting up the blowfish and stuff.
Yeah.
And he's got like a bunch of ninjas with swords, and they're chasing him down with katanas and stuff. Very cool. I'm all around ninjas. Like I get around that. That's awesome. But there was this one scene where he's like sitting down on the couch, really close to John Wick, and he's like a fanboy.
Yeah.
And he's being like super sort of up to him and really goofy. And then after that, have that massive big fight with the guys out of the raid, and they're like just smashing each other through like glass ceilings and stuff. And John, like the Wick, doesn't ultimately kill them. He sort of just lets them go. And I just remember like watching that going, I don't know what it is. The fight scene's cool, like everything's awesome, but what is it? And I realized I was like, this is not tonally consistent with the rest of the series.
I would actually make the argument that the whole series is tonally inconsistent because the first film is it's a lot more kind of gritty from my memory, and kind of a lot more serious and grim. The second movie is a bit more kind of action movie, like it's a bit more lit up. It's a bit more like kind of just like fun action film, whereas the third one's a bit too goofy, in my opinion. I agree that the third one gets too anime. Actually, the third one, it's really like it feels really anime in a lot of ways, if that makes sense to anyone. I personally like the second one the most. I think the second one's the best one, and that's actually a case of I really love its ending on its own, but it's a sequel hook just so that they can make another one, and I don't like that aspect of it, but I like the kind of ambiguous ending. I know a lot of people don't. But I do think I think each one of those movies has a different tone that it's going for. And I think it's kind of like whatever. Like I don't really care that much. I think one has its things that are good for it. I think the kind of gritty tone works better for one than it would have been two. I kind of like the more action like drive focus on two, and how kind of fun it is, and like how well put together it is. But I agree that the third one's just kind of unsatisfying for me, and I do think it's kind of the goofy tone that it takes, where I think it gets a bit too confident in itself, is what it is.
I just feel like, dude, honestly, after that particular moment where that guy was just a fanboy of John Wick's, that was where I was like, that was the one scene in there. And I understand you need a bit of comedy, you need a little bit of like lighthearted and stuff. And John Wick isn't without its comedic moments. There are moments in it which are kind of funny, but they're darkly humorous. It's in the middle of a fight, like he's fighting a dude, goes to shoot him, can't do anything, so he like reloads really fast and then blows the guy's head off. Like I find that stuff kind of darkly amusing. But
yeah.
With a lot more on that level of stuff, and it just adds to the cool factor. And then when there's this fanboy and there's a bunch of these like guys with karambits, and like they're just like they smash each other through so much glass that you're sitting there going, "Am I supposed to be laughing right now? Am I supposed to be going, this is still awesome?" And
Yeah.
watch every single John Wick movie that comes out because I love the action. I love how slick it is. I love I love so much about that series of films that I'll watch everything they keep bringing out. But just for me, there was a tone shift there that was just enough to make me go, I don't know what's happened here, but there's been a tone shift. And now I suddenly don't feel as invested in this as I did before. And I think
Yeah.
that's just one example of tone for me. That's a really important aspect of it. And I think that really does bleed into your endings. And that's what can make some endings feel really unsatisfying, is there's a tonal shift right towards the end of it. Yeah, that's another aspect for me for sure.
Yeah. You really need to consider how you're presenting the film. And what we're saying all kind of ties in, which I think is good. Like we kind of established it. It's really just a matter of like presentation ultimately and how you're kind of presenting everything up until the ending. You need to, and I obviously, like you said briefly before, there are some people that can write on the fly and then they write a satisfying ending. But I do think having a layout helps a lot as a writer, unless you're like really talented, obviously, or something. It doesn't even have to be like a formulated structure where you've written everything out. So long as you have an idea of where you want to end, I think the ending is got like the makings of a good ending because you'll at least know what you're building towards. If you write a story and you have no idea what you're building towards, I do think there are problems with that, but there are obviously ways that you can kind of work around it and eventually build something satisfying. And a lot of the stuff we talked about is just kind of a matter of like, it's just like we either weird tone shifts or just kind of changes in focus that end up kind of feeling against what we've been established up until that point. And as I said,
Yeah.
endings are hard to nail. I do think endings are the hardest part of a story to write.
Yeah, man, and that's another thing. Like, this is this is sort of a more meta point, I suppose, as well. Is I think you're saying that it's really, really hard to write endings, and I 100% agree with you. I think another thing that's really, really hard, and I think this is for writers everywhere, is knowing where to end.
Yes, that is another good point.
That's huge, dude. Because let's say that you're writing in a weekly Shonen Jump type thing, like you don't really want it to end because you need the money. So you want to keep it going, you want to string it out, you want to have filler, you want to do this, you want to do that. Like, you got to keep padding it and making it happen, but you can still ideally have an ultimately really satisfying ending off that. I think it's very similar with just about anything. It's knowing where to just put the cork in it and go, this is all there's gonna. And I think it's become very difficult, especially in like when media and entertainment and everything's so huge now, is to know when just to be able to call it
Yeah.
and then go, this is the end of it. There will not be any more of this. This is the end. That's it right there. We're done.
Yeah.
So tough. It is so hard to do, I think, because again, if you're just consistently pumping that stuff and you're making money off it, it's great, and you get around it and you're like, this is really good. I'm thinking of there's a multitude of books that I could name that I really enjoy the endings of. And there's some I really dislike. I mentioned Aragon earlier. I think that's the Inheritance cycle is one. Harry Potter, I had ultimately a decent ending, although I'll agree with you that got a bit trigger happy towards the
I don't think Harry Potter's ending sucks. I just think that there are aspects that suck.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm just trying to think of really big, like, overarching stories that have been hugely popular. I didn't find the Hunger Games very satisfying for an ending.
Hunger Games sucks. Yeah, the ending's awful.
It's not good ending of the Hunger Games. That was a big one for me. I just didn't like the way it was. I didn't like the way the whole thing sort of worked out. It was just, yeah, I don't know. It felt like it was lacking. It felt like it didn't have a satisfying payoff. And there's any other number of series. We're going to run into that issue of where do we call this and how are we going to wrap it up. So I agree with you in the sense that you need to be able to sit there and pace it out and go, this is what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to finish it, and this is where we're at, and this is how it's all sort of working. I agree with you. I think it's super important. It's just it's also as a writer, I think one of the trickiest things is just knowing where to call it.
Yeah.
If you hit a critical mass, and I think this comes down to what you were saying about was with planning. Like you should have an end point in the series in mind on some level, and if you don't, then it's going to be pretty rough because you're going to have to find a way to build up towards this ultimate thing. And it's got to feel good, and it's got to have all your narrative threads tied up, and it's got to be this, got to be that. And I think one of the issues with this is if you've got a long-running series, let's say, for instance, you've got a series of villains that keep turning up, it's like you've got to keep up in the ante.
Yeah.
The villain's got to be dangerous on this one. The next villain's got to be more dangerous again. The next villain's got to be more dangerous again. Like, it's got to keep happening. It's got to keep escalating. and that final villain's got to kind of be either the man behind the man behind the man behind the man, or just some dude who just turned up as an elemental incarnation of all the evil in the world. And then you've got to be able to do that, and then that's got to be the end, you know.
Yeah.
And that's one of running issues if you're running like just hundreds of chapters or dozens of books. Where do you ultimately call it, and who is the big bad guy? At the end of it all, I think that those are the big ones. Those are the sort of that's one of the biggest struggles of being a writer and doing endings. I think is knowing how to end it, but also where to with extended series.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I think this would be where we end this discussion. Because we've talked about this a lot. Unless you have something else that you want to bring up briefly.
No. Oh, are we? How far are we into this?
Oh, like this. That was like about 50 minutes of discussion. We can have another topic. I just think that's the end of that topic. I think.
Yeah. No. I was actually going to ask you. My whole question about the whole thing was going to be, well, how do you write stories?
Oh God.
I was genuinely interested in this. I wanted to know about your process.
That's good actually. I actually wanted us to talk more about writing at some point.
Yeah, because I had I've obviously we've had discussions about this off the pod, but a big part of what I was always curious about was like, how do you go about finishing things? How do you go about calling stuff? How do you go about structuring the story? How do you come up with ideas? Like process. I've always been pretty curious, and I mean, if these are all trade secrets and you don't want to talk about it, I get you.
Oh no, I'm happy to talk about them. So I am a fucking mess when it comes to story writing. Honestly, like just realistically, I'm an absolute nightmare. If I actually had an editor, I'd be an editor's nightmare because my creative process is I just think of random ideas occasionally, and I'm like, damn, that would be pretty good, and then I end up working on it from there. But essentially, like, it's weird because I've gone through multiple phases when it comes to writing. Sometimes when I was younger, I would just fucking write like self-insert stories all the time based on games and all the things that I was reading or playing or whatever. But now as it's like I've gotten older, I think like the idea is I take inspiration from things that are around me. I don't like inherently copy things like I did as a child, which was just copyright fucking infringement, really. Like, jeez. It was just a lawsuit waiting to happen if those ever got published. But now it's kind of more like I know what I like and I take inspiration from it. And when it comes to ideas, it'll mostly be things that I think of while I am reading or watching things. I'm like, oh, that would be pretty cool, or something, or just like doing things in general. And maybe in random conversations, someone will say something. I'm like, oh, that's actually interesting. Maybe I'd want to write something like that. When it comes to my actual writing process, I've changed a bit over the years where I did put a lot of preference earlier in my life to actually planning things out and like actually making a map of things and kind of writing things out completely, like making sure that I knew what happens with everything. I had to know everything to happen before I'd start writing things, or else I wouldn't feel confident in it. This year, especially, because I think I mentioned it earlier, where I've been trying to write once a week. Well, like it can be anything from like just writing one sentence to writing like a whole passage. I just want to try and sit down and write something once a week, and I've been managing that pretty fine so far the whole year, which has been pretty good. But because of that, I've kind of just been writing and not actually planning out a lot of things. Like, I mean, a lot of the things I'm writing are things I have gotten planned out already, but I'm kind of just more naturally just writing whenever I feel the motivation to now, and kind of just like getting my thoughts out, and then I'll come back and like edit over them now. But I do like to have a good idea. I am kind of that kind of plan things out thing, or like, and then write things. I want to at least know where I'm going, and then I'll write that. The thing that's different with me though is that a lot of the time I don't know the names of any of my characters when I'm writing. Like,
Okay.
I am terrible with naming anything. Like writing titles for a book, writing names. I'm awful. I am so bad when it comes to naming things. You'd notice you had to fucking make my channel name. I have no creative juices when it comes to like naming things. I don't know what it is with me. I just can't do it. I cannot name things. All my names are just generic or like super simply thought out.
I got you. I mean, you obviously you bank more on that horror angle, or I imagine you also go in for interpersonal dramas or deep psychological kind of stuff.
Yeah, interpersonal dramas and deep psychological stuff sounds about right for me.
No, it's interesting, dude. So you sort of just grab an idea as you sort of through, and and then you just sit down and start like you work through the concept. Like, so how much time do you spend on? You formulate a concept first, and so how do you go about doing that?
I think for almost everything I've done, I probably spent more time formulating the concept than I have actually writing it. Honestly, I think it'd be fair to say that I spend because a lot of I just fucking get distracted during the day, and a lot of the time I'll just start thinking about the story or something instead of actually what I'm doing in front of me or whatever. And
Yeah.
so it basically means that a lot of my spare time in the day is me just thinking about stuff and being like, oh yeah, I could do something like this or this. And a lot of the time, it's me thinking of the characters and the kind of character interactions in between events and all that, or just events I want to write or something. A lot of the time as well, it's me trying to figure out what the ending actually is. Because like I said, I think the ending's the hardest thing to write. When it comes to writing things, I want to at least have an idea of where something ends because I don't want I don't want to write something and then halfway through it find out that this would be a more satisfying ending or something. But ultimately, maybe that will happen when you're writing something halfway through. You're like, actually, this would be a better ending for all these characters. Because that's something we didn't talk about before. But as you're writing things, you might actually come to understand your characters differently. I believe, like as you're writing out your characters and like everything that happens, you start to learn more about them. I don't think any character you write ends and like starts and ends the same as like how you planned. I know a lot of characters for things I've written, their whole character arcs ended up changing inherently because I figured I started interpreting them differently and considering their approaches differently as to how I initially did. And it's weird to verbalize like that. I don't know if you understand what I'm saying. When it comes, you do,
Yeah. They almost take on a life of their own, right?
yeah,
And you've like I've got a number of things I could say about this, but I'll let you finish your train of thought. I think but yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about, dude. I know what that energy is, because you've established a certain character and then you put him into a certain situation, and then you start to find that character does his own thing or her own thing or whatever it might be. That they just go in a direction where you're not almost anticipating it. You're not thinking about that.
yes,
But because you can then, like, they might steer themselves towards the crazy void of your imagination where you haven't allowed for this to happen. But you're like, oh, okay, now you come up with stuff on the fly. Now I need to explore this in a different direction. Yeah, man, that's one of the things I love most about the process is when characters sort of take on their own energy and they do their own things. And if they're consistently written and they've got a pretty obvious goal in mind, they might decide to veer off the path you're constructed out for them and do something completely different.
yes.
Yeah, they almost take on a life of their own, man. I really enjoy that process. Yeah.
I do as well. Yeah, no, it's yeah. And so especially like narrative writing or like story writing. Like I said, I initially was more focused on kind of planning. I've become a bit more accustomed to just kind of writing and just like going with the flow and writing as it happens. But I still like to have that kind of planned out thing, like knowing what I'm writing about, knowing what the end goal is. But I do recognize that things change halfway through. Sometimes while I'm writing, I'll be like, actually, I feel like the character would do this instead, or I feel like this is more appropriate for the character. And especially as like one story in particular I can think of, the ending's like completely different to what I envisioned the ending being at the start, like what it is nowadays. And it's just a matter of as you write more about your characters, you learn more about them. You figure out more of what this character actually is, and you figure out what's more appropriate for their ending and what would be more satisfying as a payoff. And yeah, that ending, writing that satisfying ending is a matter of understanding your story as well and understanding what feels satisfying for these characters.
Yeah.
It's interesting for me as well because while I've been writing like stories as well, I've been writing because I'm trying to get like an actual YouTube thing going. Because I've been writing scripts for YouTube videos as well. That writing process is completely different to my writing process for stories, where it's basically like writing an essay almost, where I actually have to plan out everything I'm doing and know what I'm writing, know what argument, what points I'm making, whatever. It's like completely different to my creative writing process. So where it's way more formulated. I have like an actual structure listed, and I have points loaded down for what I want to write and everything. It's a different process entirely. Maybe you got that when you were writing some of your blog posts as well. That it's like a completely different process, or maybe it's the same process for you. I don't know.
Yeah, man. You start off. I think this ultimately is the point of writing on the whole, and I think it's true of essays. This is true of stories. It's true of scripts. It's true of anything. Start off with wanting to say something, and I think a lot of the time it's like you have a hypothesis for an essay, say, or you have an idea for a video that you're going to make. Talk about horror endings, let's say. Or we'll take an example of earlier. I want to talk about horror endings, and so what we've just managed to do, about bounce ideas off each other in sort of free flowing format, which I very much appreciate. by the way. And being able to sort of explore and look into different levels, and you begin to discover things about that one thing that you wanted to say that you weren't necessarily thinking about when you started off. And you meander in different kinds of directions, and your imagination just kind of takes over and pushes you into certain corners. So it tests you. Essentially, you have to test your own hypothesis against your imagination or against your own knowledge. And I love that the most about the writing process. I think is that there's an enormous amount of freedom in it, but you kind of really this is sort of an echo back to what you were just saying before, which is you need an endpoint. So yeah, I have a slightly different process, but just to sort of like yours, I think one of the greatest things is just being able to sort of go with the flow, but point in mind, and then it's almost like a puzzle that you're constructing in your head and having to fit all the pieces together and make all on the fly. And then if it ends up with, and ideally end up with a reasonably cohesive message or a story or a concept that you're trying to sort of present to an audience. Yeah, man, I know exactly what you're talking about with that.
Yeah.
Solid. So, and you say you tend to move more towards sort of psychological, horror, in-depth kind of. I imagine you'd be. I don't think I've ever read any of your stuff.
Probably not. I'm very safe. I'm very like closely safeguarded to my stuff when it comes to reading stuff.
Yeah, man. It's just very. I imagine like you, because as a person, I know that you're not. I'm not gonna say you're withdrawn, but you do a lot of thinking. You're a sort of deep and serious thinker about a lot of things, and I can imagine a lot of your work would be deeply personal, deeply psychological, deeply spiritual, I suppose, in some ways. And yeah, I imagine a lot of your stuff would be a lot more internal.
Yeah.
It have a lot of depth to it.
Yeah, I have a lot more of a preference to character writing than I do anything else. That's definitely what most of my works are more targeted towards, is kind of more character studies of like the characters I'm writing, and kind of more of an internal process of like what the characters are, what their growth is, what their character arcs are, like how they evolve throughout the story, what they value, and what leads to their ending and all that. Yeah, I'm definitely way more character focused than anything else.
Yeah, man. What do you find are the biggest like obstacles or the biggest roadblocks? Let's suppose that you're actually sitting down and you're writing stuff. What are the biggest sort of pitfalls or traps you tend to find yourself falling into?
Um, I think like in general with character arcs, I think my thing that I like always get the most cautious with is how to actually write character growth without it being not subtle, I guess. And especially for like development, like for character development and for character changes, you want the characters the changes in the character to feel natural. You don't want characters to start acting completely different out of nowhere, and and for them to be like kind of giving the impression that they've changed. You want to be able to actually see the change or something. I think BoJack Horseman's a good example of that. Like you might know what I mean from some of the early seasons where the character growth is a lot more kind of subtle and slow built, and instead of like just characters changing over like one or immediately like after an episode, it's way more about like the steady changes and how they slowly grow rather than them actually completely outright changing. And that's more of the thing that I want to write as a person. And so I struggle a bit with that when it comes to character writing, where I don't want characters to kind of just change completely out of nowhere. I want it to be more of a steady build up, and it's hard. It makes me respect series that can do it so well, like BoJack especially. It's not as easy as just kind of saying, "Oh, I'm going to have them change slowly over time," because you need to really lay the foundations, and you also need it to be understood why they're changing. They can't just change for no reason. The reason that's the catalyst for like this change also needs to be laid out clearly.
Yeah, you need to establish it in the tone of what you're doing, and tone's a very hard one as well, right? Because
Yes.
sometimes you know exactly what you're going for.
Yeah.
That can be quite tough.
Tone can be very frustrating to work. I think like a lot of my issues as a writer is more comes down to like the literary talents. I still get like mixed up with like past and present tense a lot, and it's all a matter of just like going through and correcting things over and over again and being like, yeah, right, I need to change this and this. I'm like definitely hindered a lot more by those kind of technical aspects, but there are stuff, like I said, the character growth kind of character arcs things are things I still struggle with as well, and like traps I fall into where I write something, then I come back and I'm like, well, that's not really subtle, I want to change that a bit, and then I end up rubbing it out or like erasing it. And a lot of the time, my writing process is I just edit the same page over and over again for weeks on end, and then like eventually I'm like, all right, now I move on to the next page.
And what would you say like your greatest strengths are? I suppose as a writer, like what do you feel good about when you're writing?
I do like my character interactions a bit. I think I'm somewhat happy with how my characters interact with each other, and I kind of do like my character. I like my characters a lot as well. I don't think I'm great with. I don't think I've like nailed the character development aspect yet, but I do think that the character growth, or not character growth, the character interactions are something that I can say I'm fond of.
Okay, that's awesome, man. That's really good to hear. And so, so when you start down, you've got a concept, and then do characters grow out of the concept, or do you have a character
Definitely,
and then the
yeah.
concept?
I would say that it's more. Well, some of my concepts are just born like are inherently ingrained into the characters, like for stories. So the actual characters themselves are what the stories come from, but they are kind of the concept. But there are some concepts where I've written it and I'm like, oh, I want a character like this at some point in the story, or I want like these characters to be a part of the story, or I want these characters to act this way. So it's a mix of both, really. It depends on what the story is. Because I'm more character focused, obviously, like that does mean that some of my stories will be born from characters rather than concepts alone.
No, I got you. And is there anything you right now that you're happy about, or?
Oh, there's a few things. I'm a bit all over the place right now, though. Like, there's nothing in specific. I'm kind of just reading whatever, and it's like it's a mix of like jumping back and forth between YouTube stuff and creative writing.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
But yeah, what about you? What about your writing process? This isn't just an interrogation of me. You got to put yourself out there as well.
No, I'm genuinely curious because I've never really had a conversation with you about like just on a more meta level.
Yeah, we don't talk off stream.
I think a big part of just a big part of that was like it's actually quite. I think we're really tough. Just as a side note, to verbalize how you do things.
Yes. Yeah.
If no one asks you the question, you never go. I've never really thought about how to explain this to somebody. But now the entire internet will have some basic grasp of how you do things, right?
Yes, because they value that so much. The wasteland that we speak to.
No, my process is different, dude. It started off as like pretty much what you were doing, blatant rip-offs of already established that I was very fond of. I started off with a lot of fantasy and superhero stuff, and to be quite frank, I never really left that. I don't think. So in terms of like genres, I like moving in. I like essentially. I've boiled this down a number of times, but I think most of what I write always comes down to superheroes of some description. I think that what I find really fascinating, what I really enjoy writing about, is superpowers and like magic or technology or whatever the case, mutations, whatever the case may be. I'm a massive superhero nut, always have been, and I think that a huge chunk. I watched the first Spider-Man at a very formative age, and Star Wars and all the rest of that sort of stuff. I think a big part of it's always been for me is like I am fascinated with what I suppose on some level what power or what how I can take like an idea or a concept for people who have greater than natural abilities and sort of make explosions and crazy stuff out of it. My taste in movies and my taste in media is very similar to how I write. I absolutely adore explosions and fight scenes and martial arts and just good old action flicks and superheroes and like magic fantasy stuff and all of it. I absolutely I love all that stuff because it's escapist. I think the big part of me has always just been trying to escape from the sort of dull banality of reality and be able to go into a place where I can fly and shoot laser beams out of my fingertips or something, something crazy like that.
Yeah.
And I think in a lot of senses, my writing is a lot more self-insert in the sense that I'm not necessarily inserting myself into a character, but I think I tend to find that my main characters, I always write from the first person exclusively, just about. Doing thirds quite tough for me for whatever reason. I'm just much more instinctively able to sort of project my writing into a character.
Fair enough.
And I think a big chunk of it is, yeah, I just like the genre is always going to be, well, if you're going to read some of my writing, you can probably expect fights, superheroes, superpowers, hidden worlds, like just all that sort of stuff as a general rule. And if it's not a hidden world, then it's on a fantasy world or on another planet or something crazy just out there. I don't really, I don't mind me a little bit of introspection here and there, but I wouldn't say that I write deeply psychological thrillers that sort of deal with and, I don't have that same kind of depth. I'm basically just a 12-year-old with a on crack, I think.
There's nothing wrong with that.
I just love all that stuff, man. I started off doing all that stuff, and I think because I don't know if everyone knows this, I do a bit of writing every now and then for an entity that will go unnamed, and so I essentially I write for someone else, and I write their ideas, so they actually have like a concept and an outline of where they want things to go, And when I started doing that, I actually found a completely different way of writing because initially I am one of the seat of the pants menaces that you were talking about. I never start a story knowing where the ending's going to be, and to a degree, I still don't. I always want to surprise myself, and I want to excite myself with the process. And as a result, most of the stories that I've quote unquote finished have incredibly weak endings because I never knew where it was going to end. Which is hilarious, right? Because we're just talking about what makes it good, but I think, yeah, with myself, like I just kind of shove all of my time and energy and imagination into one thing, and then I just is vomits out of me, and then it kind of takes on this weird sort of shape and form. And I like to keep it pacey and exciting, and if there's not fights or something crazy going on in it every couple of chapters, I'm starting to lose interest in it. I think a lot of the time, and I'm sure you've run into the same curse where you might start a project and then not finish it, and
Yes.
then go on to something else. Oh, dude, I have so many different stories that I've started
Oh
and
yeah.
never finished. I must
Oh
have
yeah.
done like hundreds of the things.
Yeah, there's a lot.
And so when I went over into the sort of more structured, I hazard, I guess, like, I would hesitate to call it professional, but I think structured was a big part of it. So it was, and another really cool thing about this, I think, was I didn't have control over the concepts. I didn't know what was going on, so I would just get given a concept. Okay, write this. It needs to have these elements. This is the tone. These are the characters. This is what's going to happen, and this is ultimately we're going to end this for this book, and then we'll do sequels and whatever else. So it's writing for money. So you want to continue to pump out books, doing that kind of stuff. And so as a result, I actually started to adapt to that structure. And what I found was that if I'm not writing my own ideas, you still have a lot of creative license. Even if someone gives you a concept, you're not going to be writing it like they would write it. You're going to be writing it like how you would write it, and you're going to bend the rules and you're going to push on walls. And I'm going to ask questions about, hey, can I tweak this or change this, or can we do this, or can we go in these different directions? Because it's just a natural part of the process. And oftentimes, I will come up with stuff for the concept is not necessarily better, or it might be better, or a different direction that focuses on different stuff. But it's just designed to be, fun, easy, pulpy, page turn kind of stuff. So I would say less substantial, a lot less sort of nails into the human experience, which I think is a mark of good writing, really. I think that ultimately good writing has good catharsis, and it does leave you with a good taste in your mouth, or maybe a bittersweet taste in your mouth, but it does make you think about things. And I'm not in the business of writing like that for the most part. I recognize it in media for sure, but I don't necessarily write like that myself, because I think that in a lot of ways I've been sort of structured and I've pushed myself into a different kind of direction. But for myself, most of the time, it's like literally just a question of what if. So I go, okay, what if? So for instance, one story idea I had, which was really dumb, and it's been done to death 100 times before, but it's this idea of, okay, what if there's gates that open up all over the world, and creatures come out of them, and they're like extra dimensional creatures just from a different plane of reality, and then all society has to adapt around this, and there's super. Like the radiation from it gives certain people superpowers, and they get snapped up by the local governments and trained into like special forces superheroes, essentially. So what happens if you have invaders come from a different place, and the people best equipped to fight them are like superpowered individuals, and they get recruited by governments, put through military academies, they become like uber trained special forces superhero guys, and they have to go and fight these like gradually scarier. And so then that would be the sort of what if concept. So that's the elevator pitch, if you will. That's how it sort of works. And then from there, you just go, okay, so what are the mechanics of it? You have to flesh it out. And so you have to go, okay, here's how the world works. Here's the consistencies. How does your magic system or how does your superpower system work? Like, we need some parameters around this, because if you don't have it, then you lead towards the ass pull thing of, I don't know, how does he do that? It hasn't been explained. It's not consistent. The tone's shifted. It's annoying.
Yeah.
Worlds need rules, and particularly when you write in your own worlds, you need to have like internally consistent rules in those worlds.
Yeah.
And to break them, you need to be pretty, serious about. Like, you need to be pretty well established. This is how it's done, right?
Yeah, especially if you have like a power system kind of thing in play, you need to actually know how the power system works for a story.
Yeah, which is why, say for instance, in Code Geass, I really like that power system, because it's a very simple, straightforward, common one. Right?
Yeah.
And these are how the powers work. How the Geass works. Yeah, and this is how it plays, and this is how it works. What it does. And these are the limitations around it, because in a lot of ways, and I think this is the case with every story, and good writing, I think, demands this, is that you need to have limitations, you need to have structures, you need to have boundaries you can't cross within the story. And as a younger sort of writer, I used to find that incredibly limiting, because I was like, no, I just want to tell any story that I want to tell, and I'll make up the rules as I go along, and it's whatever. But start to realize that actually the story will suffer if you don't have hard limits on what can and can't be done, particularly if you're dealing with, fantastical bullshit, right? So yeah, that's a lot of what I really enjoy, man. And a lot of the time, I'll come up with the concept, and then I'll just have my main character, who will probably carry certain exaggerated aspects of my own personality, usually. But yeah, they will evolve into their own people, and they'll do different things because a lot of the time, it's just I'm going to take my, let's say, my social awkwardness that I sometimes have, and I'm going to turn that into a character, or just my unrelenting rage against the human race that becomes another character, or my frustration with my bitterness and cynicism around relationships, say, might be another character that I have. And there's any other number of things that would happen, and that's sort of how these characters tend to. That becomes this sort of defining trait, and then you need to come up with a goal. Like, what do they want? What ultimately do they want?
Yeah.
And talking about the whole like fantastical new world or whatever, like that can be very tough because you're like, well, you've now been confronted with an entirely new reality where people can fly and shoot fireballs. What does your guy do at that point? Like, if you've got a guy who's become entrenched in a magical hidden underbelly of the world, what does he want? That's tough. Because it's like, well, does he want power for himself? Does he want save people? Does he want to become a real life superhero? Is he selfish? Is he like, you have to ask all these questions, and consistency with that's something I always struggle with. So I think one of my biggest sort of drawbacks is always focusing in on consistent character motivations and how to get from A to B, and then coming up with an ending or a red that whole. I think those are the big ones for me, ultimately. So yeah, that's more or less how I do it, man. I take a concept, some kind of crazy idea that I've just cooked up in my head, and then I build a whole world and a story structure around it. And I think through it now a lot more than I used to. I do write out like sort of beats and get a rough structure of where it all goes. But a lot of the time, I'll just throw window and go off and veer off in a completely different direction because it's a lot more interesting to go in that direction than the one I was going in anyway. And then we try and join up with the regular highway when we get around to it,
Yeah, that's fair enough. Everyone has their different writing processes. Like we all do things differently, and if it works for you and you can get like a book written or something finished, then I think that's fine. If you're somewhat, if it doesn't, if the ending, if you're only like somewhat satisfied at the ending, at least you got like a satisfied ending or something. But yeah, we all have a different ways of writing. It's not like there's a right or wrong way. There's just there are wrong ways, I guess. But I really need to plan out things. But I can understand that some people don't need to plan out things or don't worry about it too much and just go with the flow. And there's some credit to that as well, like just being able to do that. But yeah, there's different steps that can be taken.
I also don't edit at all, really much.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm like I would be an absolute menace to editors as well. But I think that because I am pretty self-critical of my own work. I think we all are on some level as people who write books. But look, I'm critical of it, but it's more like just let's pull out all the stops. Let's sink a liter of coffee and let's get into this. Let's just see what happens.
There's some good things you can say about that. Really,
I'm as much along for the ride in some cases. I feel as because I tend to find I get action, and if I'm stuck in that world and I don't let myself leave it, I can get like a lot of words down on the page, man. I can get the story actually rolling, and I always get stuck on beginnings. So that's another thing. I always start it like some people say. I start from the middle, or I write it backwards. I have no idea how people do that. I got to start at the start and go sequentially.
Yeah,
I'm just not good at skipping ahead and then filling in gaps behind me. If that makes any sense. Yeah, that's how I think, man. That's how I write. Yeah. Yeah, it's just it's a goofy way. It's just interesting to sort of see the difference. I think in a lot of ways, it's how you go about writing a novel is it can be indicative somewhat of your personality.
I was gonna say that when you're talking about like self, like how some characters might have some kind of self-insert aspects of you or something. Where I feel like there are a lot of authors where I feel like inherently what your characters write will have some similarities to you. It's a bit hard not to in some way, especially when it comes to the main character, because that's the perspective you're writing from. There are obviously I obviously disagree with the notion that characters are completely indicative of what the author is. Like, if someone makes a character that's inherently flawed, that doesn't mean that author's flawed or is like as bad a person as the character. Obviously, that's fucking stupid if you think that. But there are. Sorry, could you repeat? You cut out a bit.
Oh, no, that's all good. I was talking more about like approaches to writing, or the way you write can actually be somewhat indicative as well of how you write things. Because you tend to move a little bit more slowly, you chew on things, you chew over very hard. I'm all about throwing my brain into the back seat with the rest of the Macca's wrappers and just go for it.
Nice.
It's full send or not at all type business, and I think that's a kind of how I do a lot of things myself as well. I get very invested in it, and I just go for it as hard as humanly possible, as opposed to sort of being a bit more cerebral, sitting back and thinking, mulling over it. I'm just more like, let's just go, let's just see what happens.
Yeah.
But yeah, man, that's sort of how I approach things. That's how I go about doing things. Nah, I just think it's very interesting. We're both talking about like endings and how they all sort of work, and then our own processes and our own sort of approach to endings
Yeah,
as well.
no, that's fair. It's a good topic to follow up of the last one, honestly.
Do you have anything else you'd like to discuss, sir?
Um, I have a few topics, but I think I want to do some research for some of those topics, so I think we'll do them next time. I think this is a good place to end the episode. I'm feeling a little tired as well, so it'd probably be a good time to end it.
I am an hour in front of you, I think, as well. So for you it's 4, for me it's 3. So yeah, that's totally fine. All right, man. Well, hey, look, really good discussion, man. I really enjoyed that one. That was really solid.
It was a fun episode with Pete's underwater ASMR and occasional clucking from chickens that I did hear every now and then.
How about it? Chicken AS
Chicken ASMR.
for the listeners who have just sat in on a little pale conversation between Shaun and I. Thank you very much for your patronage, as always. We're looking at getting into the actual audio platforms, so we'll stop talking about YouTube and actually start talking about other algorithms. So maybe we'll have a better chance of people listening to us drone on about things on other platforms. That'll be coming soon at some point. Hopefully sooner rather than later. But we'll see what happens. Anyway,
Yeah, we'll
stay
see.
tuned. Frosty, enjoy yourselves.
Yeah.
Especially what with everything that's going on in the world. Just remember, we, on some level, not necessarily us, but people do care about you. So keep a chin up. Do you care about the listeners, Shaun?
All right.
They go all right. Well, I love you guys, and I appreciate you all. Okay, you have a good one,
All right.
Shaun. You look after yourself, mate, and I'll have a conversation with you next we do this.